The 1960s were turbulent years in America, full of change. The baby boomer generation had awakened, ending their age of innocence. Free love, psychedelic drugs, hard metal rock, and war. The Vietnam War, an extremely controversial war, to say the least. The war generated widespread political turmoil and civil protest. A military draft was still national policy at the time. Yet, the three gentlemen with me all joined the military by choice, and each served honorably and with well-deserved pride in Vietnam as officers. Each had different experiences in their tours of duty. Each of them will tell you about their individual experiences as Jews when they were there and now, decades later, as they look back. First, just a general introduction in the order of their membership here at Temple Emanu-El. Arthur Katz and his wife Carol were the 70th members of the then fledgling synagogue in 1979. Art has served in many voluntary leadership roles here, including 2 terms as president. Norm Zoller and his wife Harriet joined in 1982, soon after moving to Atlanta. Norm, too, has been an active volunteer leader here, including serving on the board and a term as president. And Ray Risner and his wife Judy have been members for 30 years as of the time we meet here. He also has actively participated as a volunteer leader and a member of the board of trustees. All 3 gentlemen have celebrated a number of family mitzvahs here at Temple Emanu-El. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you today, an honor for me to share your personal experiences, especially as Jews, in a very significant time of history in America. Arthur, let's start with you. You literally went into the Coast Guard Academy 2 weeks after high school.
Yes, I did, correct.
Tell us about that.
Well, at the time, prior to graduating from high school, one of the things that I knew was that within our family's financial capabilities, there wasn't enough money to get both my brother and me through college. And the Coast Guard Academy was 1, free, 2, an excellent education, and 3, in my very naive way of looking at things, an opportunity to be on the water, which is where I grew up and loved. And I could see myself water skiing and fishing, and it didn't turn out that way, but that's how I got to the Coast Guard Academy, and I graduated 4 years later.
Your graduating class was a little thinner than the start of starting with applicants for the Coast Guard Academy.
As my understanding is that in the year that I applied, somewhere near 6,000 applications were received, about 600 qualified, about 300 showed up on the first day, and 92 graduated.
Wow.
And during the first summer, we started with 300, and after 2 months, less than 150 still existed. The rest had all washed out.
Not like going to Camp Barney, is it?
Have never been to camp, so I don't know.
Norm, you put yourself on a path for the Army, I guess voluntarily, in the Reserve Officer Training Corps in college. Tell us about that.
I had thought that I might make the military a career. And so I went to the University of Cincinnati and joined ROTC my first year and stayed through it until I graduated. I learned that there basically were 2 kinds of commissions. There was a reserve commission and a regular commission. That's equivalent in terms of the fact that it's indefinite. If you become a distinguished military student, leading to a distinguished military graduate, then you were eligible to get a regular commission. About 10% are typically eligible to get that. And that was what I was interested in doing. I thought I was going to make the military a career. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to the top units in the Army, and ultimately that turned out to be the case. So I joined in June of 1962 and was deployed to Fort Bragg with the 82nd Airborne Division, which is one of the premier military organizations historically.
Now let me drop in here something. You're very unique. You were not Jewish at the time, but if all the times I've spoken to you and the things I've read, you really had a Jewish soul. So you were on a track. You were going to become a Jewish man.
Well, I think that's right. I increasingly learned about Judaism. In college, I took a course on biblical literature with a man whose name was Victor Reichert, a rabbi that was an expert on the Book of Job, along with other things. I was dating a woman at the time, and who, when I was first deployed, we were not married, but were engaged, and ultimately married in 1965. But we were committed to raise our family Jewishly.
Okay.
And I think as I look back on this retrospectively, there were so many things, so many Jewish values that guided my life through the military, and indeed after that, that confirmed that what I had chosen for myself was correct.
Ray, you on a different track altogether. Brown University, and then you're at Harvard in the business school, and you choose to leave to join the Army. What's the story behind that?
So the choice was really a forced choice. I got a call from my draft board that I was next because I was older. And I said, how much time? And they go, well, we'll give you to finish out the semester. And at that time, I really hadn't thought about going in the military, but I was looking at the alternatives. I spoke to my roommate. I asked him what he was doing. He says, I'm going to Canada. Well, I wasn't going to do that. And some of the others found defense slots where they could work with deferments. And I wasn't really interested in that. So I spoke to my dad. My dad had a friend, and he said, you know, there's a shortage of electrical engineers in the Army. There may be a way of getting into the Army with your skill set. And that's what happened. And because I was an electrical engineer, and I worked for a company called RCA Communications after graduating from Brown, which was in the long-haul communications based in New York. And I was an engineer with them, and the game plan with this company was to get more utilization out of the cables across the Atlantic and across the Pacific to get more lines available, and it's called multiplexing. So I did some work in that area. In any event, when I applied to the Army, they definitely needed electrical engineers. And I ended up in the Signal Corps.
And they put you on track to be an officer.
Well, it was more than that. I was appointed by the president directly as an officer. And with the concurrent obligation that I go immediately into active duty. And that's what happened. And I was stationed here in Georgia. Actually, my first duty station was at Fort Gordon. And there I met 12 West Point graduates. And I was assigned with them to our activities, and we became very close friends. And they understood that I didn't really know anything about the military. And they had spent 4 years in the military, like Art. And they helped me along quite a bit.
Arthur, I want to ask you one question about the academy. How many Jews were in your graduating class?
Myself and one other.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And Norm, we're in what we call ROTC, ROTC. Were there other Jews in that program?
I don't know that there were any, frankly. And of course, when I went on active duty, there were some Jews, and the chaplain typically would do services that I went to, and later in my career when I was in Okinawa, and then Harriet and I were married, we attended services on Okinawa and also went to high holidays one time when we were in Thailand.
Wow.
That was an interesting experience.
Okay. So Arthur, this is the Coast Guard. We think of protecting our ports. Fairly calm, sometimes rescue operations,
Definitely.
but fairly calm. And what were you expecting of your service when you graduated?
Well, when you graduate from the Coast Guard Academy, there are multiple tracks that you can take, meaning, first of all, everybody goes to sea once you graduate. So the choice in those days was either what they called an ocean station vessel, which is a 250 to 350 foot ship that sat out in the middle of the ocean in a predetermined grid location and broadcast radio beacons, because transatlantic flights did not have navigational capability from one continent to another. So their navigational reliability was on these Coast Guard ships that sat out there. I chose not to do that and wound up following what they call the aids to navigation route, which is taking care of all the aids to navigation along the coast. So that would be buoys, lighthouses, bridges, any kind of navigational lights, etc. I did that for 2 years, started out in Virginia, was promoted, became executive officer of a vessel based in Staten Island, and with 2 weeks' notice in September of 1965, I was told, pack your bags and be out on the West Coast because you're going to Vietnam to be a commanding officer of a Coast Guard gunboat. The thing is, the Coast Guard didn't have any gunboats then. So the search and rescue vessels, in my case, a vessel called the Point Cypress, 82 feet long, was designed for search and rescue. It was put on a freighter, shipped to the Philippines. In the meantime, I gathered a crew and had to make that a cohesive fighting unit. In the Philippines, we put on armament, we put on all the military communications necessary, we put on the damage control should we take fire from the enemy and have to deal with that on board the vessel, etc., and trained and learned and got ready to go.
Had to relearn your boat, in effect.
Yes, and of course, in my case and my entire crew's case, none of us had ever been stationed on a Point class 82-foot cutter before. So it was very, very tense. We had to do it very, very quickly, and none of us had known one another beforehand. So it was really, had to do it in a hurry, and then we drove to Vietnam, which is about 1,400-mile.
Okay.
Absolutely.
What kind of weaponry did you have? Or were there any?
Oh, yeah, there was. For an 82-foot boat, I had 550 caliber machine guns. I had something that had never been tried in war before called, you know what a mortar is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for those who don't, it basically is an artillery tube that sits on the ground. You drop the shell in from the top. When the shell hits the firing pin at the bottom, off goes the mortar. We had one that was mounted and was trigger fired. So I literally could
Aim it.
you could aim it, and it was very interesting to aim because when you're at sea, you're moving in 3 directions. When you're on the land, basically, you're on the land. So the firing and the practice to use it effectively was by always firing at the exact same moment of the sea. In other words, the sea undulates, so at the top, there's a moment before you start to go back down again where you stop. At that moment, that's when you fire. Then you reload, go down, come back up, do it again. And we got really, really good at it. Trigger fire, which was unique, never used before. Those were our main weapons. On top of that, anything I could beg, borrow, or steal from the Marines or the Navy or anybody else, we had recoilless shoulder launching rockets. I had grenade launchers. I can't remember where we kept the slingshots, but anything and everything that we could. And we also, I sandbagged several places on the boat, which is not something that you want to do because when you're rocking, you don't want all that extra weight up high. So that my men had a place to hide other than the shields on either side of the 50 caliber machine guns.
No. Norman, you were in Special Forces. Now, I've known you for a number of years, and you seem like such a soft-spoken, easygoing guy, but you really went through some very rigorous training.
It did. It was mentioned that we went to Fort Gordon. I actually wanted to become a civil affairs military assistance officer, military government officer, and that training was also at Fort Gordon. Mm-hmm. I had spent my first tour at Fort Bragg in a 4.2 mortar battery. I was a reconnaissance officer at the time and had ran the Fire Direction Center for it. I had gone to Fort Gordon and studied 8 weeks to become a civil affairs military government officer because in those days there were 2 Special Forces principal commands, one in Europe that supported Special Forces operations throughout Europe and one in Okinawa that supported about 8 countries in the Far East. And the one I went to, and chose actually to do that one, went to Okinawa and was deployed to Vietnam once I got there. In those days, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been established, and all the supplies and the logistical support were coming down through Laos and Cambodia and into Vietnam. And one of our missions was to protect those areas, those villages, those hamlets, the people who lived there, the village, the chiefs, and we did our best to offset that.
I want to get into your combat experience, but there's another story you told, because you had to learn how to jump out of airplanes.
Well,
And you had a very, really a horrifying experience when you were parachuting, practicing ones.
well, that's true also. Because I became a regular officer, you had to either go to flight training or ranger school or paratrooper training, jump training, or all of those if you chose to and were eligible to do it. So my assignment in Fort Bragg, I went to jump school within the first 6 weeks of doing that, and also went later to jump master school. But I think the thing you're referring to is on one of the jumps at Fort Bragg. It was a training jump, and those jumps oftentimes were flown with C-130 aircraft in what was called a series of Vs, where you have a lead aircraft with an aircraft on either side of it, and then there was another part of the V on the opposite side and one trailing. And on one of the jumps, one of those aircraft lost altitude after the jump had started and flew through jumpers that were preceding it. And that was a very bad situation. There were 4 jumpers that were killed. The commander of that unit was well aware of what had occurred, took the whole battle group back out to the Air Force Base at Fort Bragg, and we all went out and jumped immediately again.
Yeah.
I think it was the best thing that could have happened.
Fall off the horse, get back up on the horse.
Exactly right. So I had that training, and also when I was in Vietnam, with Special Forces, I jumped 8 times, and those are dangerous situations as well, because jumpers in the air in a combat environment
Yeah.
are a vulnerable target. We jumped at a lower altitude, 500-600 feet, so your parachute deploys and you're almost on the ground.
Right. Ray, when you decided that you're either going to be drafted or you're going to go in as an engineer and go in as a lieutenant, and have some clout anyway, and some, earn some respect right away for your specialty, were you aware you're going to Vietnam?
Yes,
You were.
I knew that.
Okay.
You had to go through a board of officers before you get appointed, so I knew that. Eventually, when I was in Vietnam, I was assigned to Army headquarters, and the sector was the electronic and communication sector, and there was a general of the Signal Corps that headed that department, and I knew him. And he had a staff, and I was on his staff, and my primary role in Vietnam was working on the towers. And the reason why this was interesting is that the Signal Corps is a support unit, combat support. Communications are very important, and there was no communications left by the French when they abandoned the country. So the Signal Corps was tasked with building long-haul communications throughout the spine of South Vietnam. And the way that was done was using microwave transmission. Microwave was point-to-point, which meant you either were on the top of a mountain or you had towers moving the signal along.
You need line of sight.
You need line of sight, that is correct. And so towers, although they sound relatively simple, were an important part of the communication system. And of course, they were pretty vulnerable too. And so the communication was a very advanced communication. The enemy knew about our system and to some extent respected it, because longer term, if they won, which they did, they wanted it. And in today's value, that communication system, that long-haul communication, would be on the order of $50 billion to put in.
Wow.
It was a ground zero to a state-of-the-art communication system.
So they didn't want to destroy it. They wanted that infrastructure there
Right.
when all was said and done.
Right. And eventually, that's what happened.
So you you were not involved in combat firsthand, but you saw it and heard it around you.
Well, yeah, we heard the mortars.
Yeah. And you
know.
were assigned outside of Saigon too, where you were
Right.
closer to.
Right, and we were near Saigon, about 30 miles away. Long Bin, which was Army headquarters, doesn't exist today. It was torn down. All the buildings are gone. It's basically just a plot of land today. And that was done, I would expect, for political reasons by the victors.
You know, it's interesting you talk about the communications, because in Special Forces we had radios that were single sideband radios. And in Vietnam, and also an exercise I was on in Taiwan, we literally could had voice communications with our support units at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So all that y'all were doing worked effectively and was important for us.
Okay, so you're off to Vietnam for your first tour.
That was the first tour. That's
Okay,
correct.
and you're Special Forces.
That's correct.
Now, some people may hear Special Forces and say, well, that's covert combat. Wrong perception?
No, that's exactly correct. There was insurgency going on. The Viet Cong were infiltrating through Laos and Cambodia, as I said a bit ago, and the Special Forces units were trying to combat that, and we did that really as best we could in as friendly a way as possible. So we were carrying out public utility projects, public health projects, public education. We had care packages that came that we distributed to our villages and hamlets, trying to maintain the peace. And we were back about 40 miles from the border and would go daily out to those bases by helicopter. This was down in the Delta. There's really rice paddies and jungle, and you couldn't drive a truck there, really.
Norm, this may have been the America's first experience with what we call asymmetrical, because you don't know who's the enemy and who's a friend.
That's right. I mean, the enemies, and it was often shown that the enemy were wearing black pajamas, and that's exactly right. I mean, they lived and they tried to disappear within the population in these villages and hamlets, and you could not tell who the good guys were, who the bad guys were. And even though, as Ray said, he was at Long Bin and somebody on a boat on the Mekong Delta, every experience that a soldier had, or a sailor had, or a Marine had in Vietnam was unique. Whether you were at Long Bin or Saigon or out in the jungle someplace, that experience was totally different from one another. I mean, with that group, but if you're working to support good and welfare and bringing in entertainers, as it happened as well from Hollywood, that was a totally different experience. And we were there for a year or some period of months. My Special Forces tour was 6 months. My second tour was with a year with the 82nd Airborne Division. So I was there actually 18 months. But all those times were different. It's hard to compare the two from one another. And we're all subject to danger and risk, because whether you're in a compound or in a rice paddy, you couldn't tell when incoming was going to be there, where the sappers were going to cross the wire. They were trying to breach where we were. And of course, our job was to protect the bases, protect the people that we were trying to guard and keep from harm's way.
So you're trying to win hearts and minds. How effective do you think that was?
Well, I think that at the time that was a bit trite, but it also was true. It was the reality of what was going on. And we tried to maintain friendships, but you couldn't tell always who the friendlies were and who the bad guys were. You had to be vigilant. You had to be on your guard. And, you know, and Art Katz and I and some others are on a committee here at the synagogue where we tried to protect our facility through direct and indirect means, passive and affirmative actions. And I think the experiences that we respectively had in those risky environments has been able to translate to a fair amount to look after the congregants in our building. So that all translates in a kind of a subtle, passive way, but nonetheless is always with us.
Arthur, you had some scary moments on the water
I did.
around Vietnam. Talk about it.
The job of the Coast Guard gunboats was to provide inshore blockading of the entire coast of South Vietnam, because in 1965, almost by accident, a routine patrol discovered what turned out to be a North Vietnamese disguised fishing trawler unloading arms and ammunition at a place called Van Ro Bay in South Vietnam. A trawler that's 100 to 120 feet long can carry roughly 100 tons of arms and ammunition. And subsequent intelligence reports determined that prior to 1965, close to 90% of the arms and ammunition that were being supplied to the Viet Cong came by water with these trawlers. The Navy, particularly in the southern part of Vietnam, did not have vessels that could go into shallow water, if you will. The Coast Guard had them, and that's why we got called. Coast Guard patrols started in late 1965. By the end of 1966, that 90% supply, and this is retroactive, looking back, historical intelligence determined that it was throttled down to less than 10%. So our blockade worked enormously well. And to put it in perspective, 100 tons of arms and ammunition by ship would be the equivalent of, say, 4,000 people, each carrying 50 pounds down the Ho Chi Minh Trail over a course of 2 to 3 months, and by ship it could be done in a week. Specific engagements that I was involved in, we were in country less than a month on a river called the Soi Rap River, which is one of the feeder rivers to the Saigon River. And by the way, 90% of the wartime material for friendly forces came up that river to Saigon. There's an area called the Rung Sat Secret Zone, completely controlled by the Viet Cong. Only occasional special forces or marine reconnaissance patrols would go in there to try to wreak some havoc. We sighted a sampan that came out from the Rung Sat Secret Zone, and of course, there's no drinking water there, so the Viet Cong had to supply themselves with it. It came out into the river. It was in a place it couldn't be or shouldn't be. We approached it. I turned on the spotlight, and one of the things I didn't say about my boat when you asked me about it was steel-hulled and an aluminum superstructure. That pen that you're holding in your hand, if you hit one of those, you could put a hole in it. So we were not well protected, and that's why the sandbags were where they were.
Right.
We intercepted the sampan. I remember vividly, I can close my eyes and think about it, realizing that this is first combat experience, and I looked down and we had opened fire, and I'm looking down and I see a Viet Cong person in the water holding onto a rope of the boat with turned out to be a Czech machine gun on her arm like this. It was female, and I said, damn, she's shooting at me. Welcome to war. Boom, and it's over. That was the first experience.
How did that affect you?
Well, on my boat, the way it was laid out, the commanding officer is up high. You're about 12 feet off the water. You've got sound-powered phones on. You're watching the radar. You're watching the fathometer. Of course, you don't want to go aground. That's not a good place for a boat to be because then you can't go anywhere, and people can shoot at you and really hurt you. So, plus you're operating the spotlight. It's a very, very involved process that happens so quickly, you don't even realize it. When the shooting was over and we had captured some of them, and we captured some important papers, etc., we were able to rescue some of the wounded Viet Cong, and the next thing you know, I was the medical officer. And so fortunately, I found out that blood and guts don't bother me too much. I sewed a couple of people up, jabbed them with morphine. Afterwards, when you realize what happened and how quickly it could happen and how close you were to harm's way, then maybe religion kicked in a little bit, and thank God I'm still here kind of thing. Yeah. That was the first combat experience. The second one was much bigger, if you will. The area that we patrolled was off the Mekong River Delta, and Norm mentioned being down in that area, and that area is rice paddies and so forth and so on. And you couldn't drive a vehicle in most cases, but the entire Mekong Delta, which is huge, was intersected by canals. and waterways. And we got intelligence reports that the Viet Cong were, if this is a delta, the main river comes down all the way from the Himalayas, so it's over 2,000 miles, and then when it gets close to the ocean, which is here, it spreads. In this case, it's spread into 5 different rivers. And the Viet Cong were supplying by going through a whole network of canals, et cetera. But when they went through across each river, that was bigger. We got intelligence. I did something which maybe was not the brightest thing that one could do, and said, I think I can get in there with my boat and maybe do some damage. And I requested permission, and I was granted permission, and I literally sailed into something that the charts we had were from the 1890s, and they were in French, and they had no representation of what we were looking at. So we had to get by the fish nets, we had to get by the sandbars. We went in at dusk on a moonless night, because that's when the Viet Cong...
It's dark, you're as stealthy as you can
Absolutely.
be. Yeah.
Got upriver, got to a point where the tide, I went in at low tide, saying if I can get in at low tide, 6 hours later, when there was a 12-foot difference in the depth of the water, I could get out. Got in, dropped anchor upstream. About 2 hours later, 3 huge junks, and when I say huge, they were as big as my gunboat, in a convoy of 1, 2, 3, kind of triangular shape, started heading across the river, which at that point is probably a mile wide. So just judging the current and so forth, we lifted anchor. When they got to just about the middle of the river, which was the point where it would take them the longest to escape to one of the smaller canals that I wouldn't have been able to get into, all guns manned, maybe not the brightest thing in the world, but as I described my boat, I had 1 machine gun, 2 machine guns, and 2 machine guns, a total of 5. So if you got 3 vessels like this, and you can bring yours in the middle, then you can fire all 5 machine guns at one time, which we did. One of the junks blew up with a secondary explosion. It looked like a miniature nuclear bomb. Knocked over some of my guys on the boat, bodies, et cetera, flying through the air. So we blew one up, sunk a second one, and I think we got the third one, but we don't know. And then we turned around and got the hell out of there before anybody knew who we were or where we were.
And you captured a colonel.
We did that too, captured some very important papers along the way. It was a proud moment, if you will. And that was the time when perhaps I came closest to my God, because I heard a bullet whistle over my left ear. And just as I said that, I heard the whistle again. And there was more, but that's probably enough for now.
Ray, you were really dealing to a certain extent with one of the issues back in this country, and that's race relations in Vietnam. Tell that story.
So the military in the Army has a long tradition. It had been integrated in 1948, but there's always some laggard movement. And there was an officer who I got to know who was a captain who had been in Vietnam for 3 years. He had re-upped 3 times. Wow. And he was African American. And he was well respected. But that's as far as his companionship and his relations with the other officers went. And I could see this. So he and I got along. And we got to talking at nights because, you know, the normal day was 12 hours a day, but you still had a couple hours after that. And he was from Texas, first college graduate from a little town in Texas. And
First college graduate of the town, not just the family.
Yeah, wow. The town was entirely African American. And he told me what his hopes and dreams were. And that was good, because nobody else would listen. I mean, they gave him assignments, he did the assignments fine, but I could see that there was a distance. And he eventually was recognized for his skills and his ability in the Signal Corps, and went into one of the organizations, which was a very quiet organization, partially military. And that was the last I ever heard of him. But that was not in Vietnam. He was promoted elsewhere. But
well, with that type of relationship
Right.
among his fellow officers. Why did he keep re-upping?
Well, it was an opportunity when you were in the combat zone. You didn't pay income taxes. You got combat pay, and he was getting good assignments, so he was getting a lot of background, and he knew he was different. He also had more or less a photographic memory. He really was a very smart man, and he played that down because that was the way he grew up. But I knew he was a very smart man. He was a couple of years older than me, and he wanted to be a major, and that was going to be a hard push for him to be a major.
So here is a black officer who is treated like an officer. That's about as far as it went with
Right.
his fellow officers.
Right.
And you're Jewish. What type of
Well,
compatibility did that build?
that probably was part of it, because I was the only Jewish officer that I knew of at the time, and of course I felt a little different. And
Did you discuss that with him?
I did. And he didn't know many Jewish people. As a matter of fact, I was probably the first Jewish guy he ever met, but he knew, you know. And so we had a little bond because we were different. And both of us were, to some extent, on our own.
Was he aware of the relationship between the black and Jewish communities in this country, especially during the Civil Rights era?
I'm not sure of that, because his part of Texas was very rural, and I'm not sure that there was a whole lot of influence of what was going on. But going in the military for him was an opportunity for advancement that he wouldn't have otherwise, and it worked. But there was a price to pay, and I don't think the other officers had that price.
No.
I just add also, in terms of race relations, both my experiences at Fort Bragg, when I first went in the service, probably 60% of the unit I was in were African Americans. It was never an issue. We were all in it together. When I went to Vietnam on my first tour, the deputy commander was African American. The man who was the operations officer was African American. Of those 30 people, and it never was an issue. Everyone had the same kinds of training. We knew what we needed to do, and I think if they would get into a difficult situation, they would do for each other.
During your second tour, is that when you were starting to go through the conversion to Judaism?
I had already begun that. It was formalized after I
How
got
did
back.
that affect you?
Well, I think I thought about this, and I think, there are a number of Jewish values that I think guide me and have guided me, and probably guided others as well. But we were helping to repair the world. This was tikkun olam. This was chesed. We were out to care for people and provide for their betterment in the performance of righteous deeds. Gemulut chasadim. We were trying to deliver justice as best we could. Tzedek tirdov. Justice, shalt thou pursue. And those have all been kind of guidelines for me, not only in the military, but then afterwards, with what I've done in my civilian career, working with the federal courts.
It sounds, Norm, like you had a strong spiritual feeling about your mission and your job.
I kind of came to a point where, in hindsight, I felt I had always been Jewish. I was attracted to the whole notion of being Jewish. It's not easy to choose Judaism, as people know who've gone through that. But once that decision is made, people who choose Judaism do it for very personal reasons, and it becomes a part of who they are. It becomes a part of their mindset.
You alluded to something that I want to get into with each of you, and that is that this was a very controversial war, and it was a very divisive war back in this country. How much were you aware of it while you were in service, and what was it like for you to come back to the United States after your service into that environment? I'll start with you, Arthur.
Okay. I came back the end of 1966, so relatively early in the 10-year 1965 to 75 period of time. I remember what I do remember and what I don't remember, fondly and not fondly. Nobody was waving a flag and happy to see me come back. I had very little in the way of minor experiences regarding Vietnam, but the fact that I was a Vietnam veteran was not anything that, in all prior wars, if you will, the United States veteran was always semi-revered, certainly respected. That did not happen when I came back from Vietnam. But coming back, my biggest focus really was, when I left Vietnam, I left a wife behind. When I came back from Vietnam, I had a wife and a baby daughter. And not a whole lot of money in the bank, if you will. So my perspective was, get on with your life and take on your family responsibilities and do what needs to be done. And that's really where my focus was. As the years of the war progressed, I was very disenchanted with the way that the American people treated the American fighting man coming back, right, wrong, or indifferent. And certainly I'm very proud to be sitting here with Norm and with Ray, and certainly you, Eric. I think we've since learned that the people who fight the battles, they're a brotherhood and a sisterhood which is very unique and a very small percentage of our population.
Not only that, they didn't declare war and assign themselves.
Yeah, I was going to say, they deserve the respect. As they say, freedom is not free, and my comrades in arms on either side of me, the three of us were among the ones that made sure that we still had the freedom, that all those who were protesting had the right to protest, if you will. But violent protests, I still have problems with that. I went as a patriot. I'm still a very proud American. I think this is still the best country in the world to live in, and I'm fortunate enough to have visited in excess of 75 countries around the world in my lifetime. But our government does us a disservice when they aren't truthful with the citizenry, and I was much more idealistic 50 years ago than I am now.
Ray, chronologically, you were there later.
I was there later.
Than Norm and Arthur, so you were more, I guess, more cognizant. It was happening even more.
Well, first of all, I want to tell a little story when I first got there, which is has to do with being Jewish. So, of course, my superiors knew I was Jewish, being the only one on the staff. And one day I get a message saying, Passover is coming up, and you get a day off if you want to go to Saigon and have a Passover meal and service. So I went, and I go to Saigon, and lo and behold, there are 200 people in this service, and I'm absolutely shocked, because up till then, which was like 6 months, I thought I was the only Jewish man in the whole country. Not that I was looking, but So I go into the service, and it's led by a colonel. And as you know, there's a Seder, there's a service, and the service has certain steps to it, as does the normal Jewish service. And I'm in the row, and I see these two fellows on my right, and they're really having a hard time doing the service, a really hard time. And they're from the tank corps, and I can see this because their uniforms are embedded with this yellow clay and I guess the oil from being inside a tank. And I'm looking at them, and that one guy looks at me, and he knows right away. So he comes over to me, he says, "You're not going to turn us in, are you, sir?" So I said, "What are you guys doing here?" And he says, "Well, we heard that if we said we were Jewish, we get a day off from being in the tank and a good meal. So we came down to Saigon from the Central Plains." And I said, "Look, you're going to get caught unless you know what you're doing. So just follow me. When I stand, you stand. When I sit, you sit. And don't do anything but what I'm doing." And that's what they did. And and that was the service. that was our Seder, and we did get a meal, which I think they flew in from Hawaii, actually.
Did these two guys like the food?
They did. They,
I was just thinking that, we don't traditionally think of matzah as something that you long for to eat, but I would have gladly traded some sea rations for some matzah if that opportunity had provided itself while I was there.
And sitting in a tank for a long time, it may be helpful. Yeah.
So, but getting back to your question
Yeah.
on afterwards, so I had some opportunity to stay in the military, but the opportunities were not to my liking. So I opted to leave because I was a reserve officer and I had done my active duty. So I go back, and I wanted to go back to school. I'm back in Boston, Cambridge, Boston, which is 1970, and the environment there, the social environment, was so anti-war, I can't quite describe it. And I basically couldn't wait till my hair grew back on because, being with virtually no hair from the Army, it identified you. But basically, it was a very cold environment, not just climate, but socially. And it took me a long time to kind of get my feet on the ground and realize that things had changed. And it wasn't like there was a debate. There were no debates. It was 99% anti-war. And Massachusetts, of course, has always been that way. And Boston was that way too. It was hard.
Were people offensive to you? Did they strike out at you?
Not really, because I wasn't wearing a uniform at that point. So, but I could sense it. And it was just, not that I expected to be, greeted, in a positive way, but I just saw all this negative outlook on everything that was going on. And, it was a pretty big shock.
Norm, what were you aware of and how did it affect you?
Well, on my first tour, I had been deployed out of Okinawa, and although we did get information, that was 1964-65. The Vietnam War situation was just building up. When I got there were 17,000 Americans. In September of '64, when I left in March, there were double that number. There were 34,000. When I went back again in 1968, there were more than 500,000. So the nature of the conflict there had changed in a dramatic way. The Tet Offensive had taken place in January 1968 when the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese attacked 13 cities simultaneously. The unit that I was with, the 82nd Airborne Division, that brigade, was deployed in direct response to what was happening. And in the first 3 months, sadly and tragically, we had more than 100 soldiers killed in my 4,000 person unit alone. Of course, ultimately, more than 58,000 were killed in Vietnam. So it was a very difficult time. In '68, '69, my wife and child were back in Cincinnati. Martin Luther King was killed in April, was assassinated in April 1968. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June the 6th, 1968. And I can remember writing letters at the time saying, here we are in Vietnam fighting a war, and there are riots in the streets in Cincinnati. When I came back in late February 1969, I've talked to other people who have returned from there. They came into San Francisco, and they were spat upon as they came through the airport, and they had uniforms on. As it turns out, and I was being discharged because I had satisfied almost 7 years active duty by that time, I went to New Jersey, and that was all military at that time, and I did not experience that. When I came back to Cincinnati then to start graduate school and then subsequently law school, I was in civilian attire, and there was still that unease. And of course the culture in the United States was still changing. Aspects of feminism and the displeasure with what was going on in Vietnam, with the horrific numbers of people being killed, soldiers being killed, was on the news continually. So it was a different time at that. And of course it was not until 1975 when Saigon finally fell that then the climate began to change somewhat. But I think a lot of that is still with us to today. We wonder about the nature of conflicts and whether or not the United States should make commitments to that.
All three of you proudly wear your Vietnam veteran hats. I've seen you in them, and I like seeing you in them. Do you find there is more respect for your service today than there was?
Oh,
at
by
the-
far.
By far.
By far. You know, it's interesting, Norm, the comments you make. One of the things I've learned in later years, and this reflects the commander of the enemy forces who lived well on past 101 years. And his name was General Giap. And he said something to the extent that when he was fighting us, he knew he couldn't defeat the U.S. Army, but he could defeat the U.S. government. And he didn't quite use those words, but that's what he said. And he was right. And we keep repeating this error, seems on and on and on, which reminds me of Afghanistan, you know. And so to some extent, the military is a tool of the government, which it is, but it doesn't get used very smartly, in my opinion. And it gets diluted down. And the other thing is that, you know, in retrospect, one of the nice things about being in the military was it was everybody. It was a draft. You had everybody in there, all different cross sections of the country. Today, it's not that way. It's a volunteer army.
Yep.
And that loses something. And it loses something not just for the Army and the military, but also for the country.
It's hard to understand really what's going on. I recall back in the early 1960s when President Kennedy was still president, he dispatched Robert McNamara and Maxwell Taylor to do an assessment. And this was the time to making decisions about whether a buildup would occur or not. They came back after being and toured all the same places, and Taylor gave his report, and Robert McNamara gave his report, and they were totally different. And Kennedy remarked to the effect that, I don't know the two of you went to the same country.
Right.
So we have different perspectives about these things. We see the same thing. I mean, it kind of goes back to the Jewish value of truth. Emet. What is truth? What is really the case? What is the situation actually? Not easy to sort out.
Yeah, and how do you get there?
That's right.
You know, how do you get there?
That's right.
Arthur?
I would add the comment that if you talk to most Vietnam veterans, all of whom now have a 50 or so year retrospective, they will tell you that given that they were not handcuffed, we Allied forces were not handcuffed in Vietnam, Vietnam would have been an American victory unquestionably. I almost liken it to if you're the 800-pound gorilla, but you're only allowed to throw bananas instead of bullets, it's not a way to win the war. And I talked to all my classmates that were there. I'm in 3 or 4 different veterans groups, and I could almost say to a veteran person, they said, that war could have been won and would have been won if it were fought very differently. But as Ray quoted General Giap, it wasn't the military that was defeated. It was the government or the politics that were defeated. And that troubles me to this day because we're repeating the same thing over and over again.
Ever since Vietnam, there has been a feeling, don't go to war unless you intend to win.
Well, I would say yes, but before Vietnam it was the same way. You didn't go to war unless you intended to
Korea
win.
was another one too, that, you know, there was very iffy, the results of that. But World War II was a win. A horrible war, but a win. Korea was just a police action.
That's correct.
And an armistice, and you know, and I think maybe the thinking was then we can beat the United States politically.
Maybe. I don't know. I have very strong feelings about the right way and the wrong way to go into battle if you're going in.
I want to cover a couple more things with all three of you. First of all, You won an award, a very prestigious award in 2010. Tell us about it.
The United States Coast Guard Academy, at some point in time prior to 2010, maybe 2007, 2008, came up with the idea of the Hall of Gallantry. In the Hall of Gallantry, as with most halls, you have two walls. One wall was the Wall of Heroes, and the other wall was the Wall of Remembrance. And the purpose of that was for future cadets to see what could be or what could not be accomplished. To be inducted into the Hall of Heroes, you were nominated by other members of the service. There was no self-nomination, if you will. I was very humbly but proudly inducted in 2010. I'm in the Wall of Gallantry, and the write-up along with that is supposed to inspire cadets to what they could do in the future, and I certainly hope it does that. To the best of my knowledge, I am, and this is a unique bit of proudness for me. First of all, when I was inducted, my entire family, which my nuclear family, including my 7 grandkids, is 15 people, plus a busload of friends, all attended the ceremony. I believe there are now other members who have been nominated who are Jewish, 2 or 3, but I'm the only one from the combat side of Coast Guard experience, and humbly but exceptionally proud of that.
Well, you served well, and you served with pride.
I would say a few years ago I heard about that award, and my wife and I were traveling in Connecticut and went to see it. We end up in this hall, and sure enough, Arthur was on the wall.
All right.
So it
all
was,
right.
it's well done, and he deserves all the accolades. This is an uncommon thing to do and to be recognized for.
Well, you very recently, Norm Zoller, picked up a coveted award yourself. Tell us about that.
Yes, about 3 months ago, I had a message from the 82nd Airborne Division Association saying that the 101st Airborne Association, the Air Assault Division, had decided that soldiers who had served with them in Vietnam and had done certain things and had received certain recognitions would be eligible to receive an honorary air assault badge. That's a badge now that has been regularized for people who join the 101st. There's certain criteria that have to be undertaken to be eligible to receive it. But the immediate previous commanding general of the 101st was able to go to the Department of the Army, and the Department of the Army does not change things easily or readily.
Nicely said, nicely said.
But he was able to persuade them that people who had served with the 101st in Vietnam during that period of time, and other units that were attached to them, there was the 173rd Airborne Brigade that was there, and the brigade that I was with the 82nd, would be eligible provided they had received certain things, a combat infantry badge, which is an award in and of itself, of which I'm proud, and I was a senior parachutist, and some other things, that you could submit an application to be considered for that, which I did. And a few weeks later, I got a message back saying that I was eligible for it, and they would send it to me by mail, or you could come to a ceremony on June the 24th at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Now, we're filming this on the 28th of June.
In the year 2021.
And 2021. So, and we're just kind of coming out of the COVID period, as it were. But my wife and I decided we would drive up there and attend that ceremony. And as it turns out, there were 450 previous soldiers who are still alive, and there were some families also, family members who came to get that. You know, in Vietnam, 2.7 million soldiers and sailors and Marines and Air Force people served in that conflict, 2.7 million over that 19-year period. So 450, in relative terms, is a small number, but we all were there, and the commanding general and some other enlisted people passed through our ranks and actually pinned that badge on us. So I'm proud to have it.
Gentlemen,
Well deserved.
you've had 50 plus years now to really look through the prism of history and experience as Jews. Can you relate how you feel about your experiences and how it has affected you as Jewish men?
Well, primarily, I always viewed myself as a patriot and an obligation to serve in the military. And I'm happy I did it. It was a tough time, both personally and for the nation, but I still think it was the right thing to do.
Arthur?
Just as Jews are a very small minority of our country, I think they're even a smaller minority in the Coast Guard. I know when I went through the academy, and I was one of two in my class, as I had previously stated, the fact that I was Jewish singled me out, if you will, for some special attention. I considered myself to be a tough kid from the New York streets, from the streets of New York, and some of the people that thought that I should get something, they weren't going to win. That carried me through the academy. Most people have a chip on their shoulders. I had a 6-pointed star on mine, but it went the same way. Once I got into the active Coast Guard, I had a sense certainly that I was a little bit different because I was Jewish, but not that I could perceive a lot of prejudice or anti-Semitism for being Jewish. However, in retrospect, many, many years later, my feelings are a little different about that. I think that that's one of the reasons, and like Ray, patriot, absolutely. Doing my duty, absolutely. God and country, absolutely. Through the years, the values of Judaism and what it means to be Jewish that's what I live my life for. And that is the anchor, I think, that carries me in my later years, much more so in the compass, much more so than in my younger years when, particularly in New York, being Jewish was maybe the majority as opposed to the minority. Very proud of it, proud of my family, proud of this synagogue and everything it's meant to this community.
Norm, you again, you had the unique quest of becoming a Jew while you were in service. So you evolved, even though you always felt Jewish, you were evolving as a Jew. And so you can look at this through a really interesting prism of how that Judaism, that transition you were undergoing in country, and today as, you may be one of the most active Jewish people in Atlanta in what you do with Jewish organizations. So talk about that.
I too am proud for having served 22 years in the Army. Those sitting around this table here are fortunate, very lucky to be here. Many are not. One of the things I did some years ago is I joined an organization in Atlanta called the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association, which initially had more than 400 members. It now has 256 members. So as all of us get a day younger every day, as it were, things are catching up, and that's part of who we are. But I think that the fact that I chose to be Jewish, the fact that we've raised our families that way, I was honored to have served in a leadership position here at the synagogue, and was also president of the Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum about 12 years ago. So I've, and others here at this table with us, have served in volunteer capacities also, and given back to Judaism in our community. Those are important things, and I think the values that I talked about early on are a part of who I am. They were important while I was a soldier. They were important while I worked in my civilian capacity with the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit And those values become very important as a part of public service. One of the regrets I have, and I worry about it for our nation, is there's only like 1% of the people now in the military. There's no requirement any longer. There's no draft. I don't have fault necessarily with that, but there ought to be, in my opinion, a requirement that everyone, every man, every woman, ought to be able to serve in some capacity. In AmeriCorps, we have a son who was in the Peace Corps for 2.5 years, was not in the military, but there ought to be, in my opinion, a mechanism by which people can serve in a public way, because it helps you to connect with others in our area, in our community, or in the nation, racially, ethnicity-wise, that I think in terms of measuring one's life and how they have gone through that life and what they have done, enhances the value of what we're doing. So I'm happy to be a part of this group. I'm proud of what they've done, and I'm proud to have a small part in it as well.
Gentlemen, well, I'm very proud to know each of you, call each of you friends, and I appreciate your time doing this. We belong to a wonderful synagogue here at Temple Emanu-El, and I look forward to many, many more good times with you and memories with you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
for doing
Eric.
this, Eric.
Thanks,
Thank
Eric.
you.